All right, what's up, everybody? What is going on? Thanks for tuning into the stream here today. It is Thursday, March 10th of 2022. We've got two-game NBA slate on tap tonight following yesterday's 12-game NBA slate. So kind of feels like a little bit of a DFS break almost. I guess there's a big hockey slate tonight. Obviously, if you were playing golf DFS heading into the players, there was a lot going on yesterday, but I don't know. Kind of feels like a little bit of a semi DFS holiday today here, at least for me. So either way, I mean, we do still have the two games on tap tonight. We'll talk a little bit in this stream. Maybe about some strategy for tonight's two gamers or how to approach some of these two game slates in general. We've got a few questions on tap here for today. We'll talk a little bit about, I mentioned the two-game slate for NBA tonight. We'll talk about coaching tendencies in the Sims. We'll talk on leverage here a little bit more follow-up from the SaberScore conversations. And we'll go from there. So, as always, if you've got questions for me, throw them into the YouTube chat. Throw them into the Office Hours channel in Slack. Kick to the Head said 13-game NHL slate. Yes, indeed. Pretty big NHL one. I have been trying to decide if I want to enter into that or not. I've got a few things. I've been waiting all week, and I've been thinking, I can push off all the other shit I need to take care of until Thursday. Two NBA games will be a good night for me to just get some stuff done. But now that 13-game NHL slate is staring me down, and maybe I'll just end up playing NHL DFS and procrastinating my I don't even know. It's dumb errands and chores and things like that just need to get done. So. But Jacob says NBA's been on fire, missed the NFL already, though. Yeah, I feel the same way. A lot of times I'm definitely a big NFL fan, but a lot of times I don't really start to feel that that burn of missing NFL until like the summer. But yeah, no, I miss it too already. So probably going to be a long off season here. But anyway, let's go ahead and let's get into this here. But first off, let's start with some exciting news. Those of you staring at the screen probably know where this is going already. Just going to throw MMA up here. Big update to the app today. Will be an announcement in the Slack later today, but you guys, the 17 of you that are watching along live here are getting a sneak peek here. Big update to the MMA Sims. So I've been mentioning for quite a while actually on stream here that for a long time, the MMA app and the builder on the MMA side was using average projections from our simulations, but it was not actually using the simulations in the process of building lineups. That is no longer the case. As of today, the MMA product, I would say, is essentially fully supported now in the app. So a few things that means. First of all, you've got a lot more data to look at here for your research. We've got percentiles, which are pretty cool. Pretty interesting. We'll talk about the distributions for fighters here in a second, but pretty interesting percentiles here in this particular sport. Detailed projections, how often wins, significant strikes, knockdowns, all kinds of different things that matter for MMA show up here in our simulations. And I mentioned here the distributions. Probably one of the biggest reasons why I was so excited for this to come out is because distributions in MMA are pretty weird. They are not normally distributed. You've got kind of a bimodal type distribution. I don't even want to say it's theoretically bimodal, right? There's kind of a split of the distributions of the fighter losing and the fighter winning, but pretty complicated here. The normal distribution assumption is just terrible in MMA. Now that this is out, when you build your lineups in MMA here, you can see I've got my settings that I was using to mess around with some research builds already loaded in here. But when you use this, we'll be actually now pulling directly from individual sims when you are building your lineups. You're going to see the default sliders for most contests are typically going to have sim variance very high, right? We want to leverage those sims aggressively when we're building lineups. Correlation slider is now showing up here as well. This is in MMA for the most part, probably not going to have any impact because the allow opposing fighters box is off by default. I would recommend if you're building lineups for GPPs, you pretty much always want to leave that off anyway. But the correlation slider is here now. In theory, if you turned this on, you could actually turn the correlation slider up or down to kind of incorporate the negative correlation of opposing fighters a little bit more or less as you wanted. For the most part, this is almost always going to be off, and the correlation slider won't really have too much of an effect, but pretty excited here. So Will's already helping me along here. He said it's multimodal with a loss by finish, loss by decision, win by finish, and win by decision. So that makes a ton of sense here. Let's pull up another fighter here that has like roughly a 50% chance. I think with a 50% chance to win fighters, you can really kind of see the multimodal nature here. Let's pull this guy back up again. Might be, there we go. Takes a second to load. Yeah. So you can kind of see, there you go. So speaking of this, along with the, the new support in the app, we will be having probably Will and Matt and maybe maybe some other members of the team will figure that all out on office hours here in the next couple weeks to come on, talk a little bit more about how this model works, how our MMA sims work, the value of using simulations for MMA. Probably we'll end up talking a little bit of MMA DFS strategy, and then that will kind of culminate. We'll end up putting out a similar guide to what we did for NASCAR, 10 or 15 minute guide, how to beat MMA DFS with SaberSim. So super excited about this. Again, I think it is going to make a huge difference overall into the quality of the lineups that get produced by the app, basically with really no real intervention or changes to projections or settings or anything like that, just because now that we are leveraging the sims themselves, those lineup constructions are going to be a lot more, have a lot more potential for upside. So super excited about that. And just wanted to start off today with a quick announcement. So cool. Let's get into some questions here. I guess we'll just go ahead and start knocking these out chronologically. This one was from, who was it from? Six Fever. And he said, what's better to play in these 2-game slates, showdown or regular 2-game full lineups? I'm playing both. Most NBA slates nowadays, I've just been playing pretty much every slate I can get my hands on. So I'm playing the 2-gamer, and I think there's showdowns for both games. Yeah, there are. So I don't know if I would say one is better than the other in particular. I think SaberSim actually is poised to really crush these kinds of slates. Actually, 2-game slates can be kind of tough, but when the optimal strategy to succeed on the slate is basically, very heavily valuing individual game simulations, like it is here for the 2-gamer and also for the showdowns, right? Those are going to be the slates where you can often get the biggest differentiating factor than compared to somebody using average projections in a traditional optimizer or even hand building, right? It's essentially, especially in the larger field stuff, you're basically going to have like the nuts tonight to win, like very close to the optimal lineup. If there's a extremely low owned surprise play that goes off, maybe you don't, but you likely need something close to the optimal lineup tonight. To do that, you essentially have to be able to take individual potential game outcomes and game scripts and build lineups that represent them. That is what SaberSim excels at. So I think both the 2-game classic slate and both showdowns are going to be a lot of fun tonight. I think there's a ton of edge in using simulations to build those lineups. And I'd play both. I'd play all three, I guess is a better way to say it. So that is what I'm doing. So cool. Let's keep it going. Interesting question from Stanley here. And he said, do the simulations take into account coaching tendencies? I'm asking because I don't want to double count what the algorithm considers. Yeah, coaching tendencies is a little vague. The answer is kind of, it depends. I would say it kind of depends on what you're including under that umbrella. I would say coaching tendencies that follow a pattern that present historically or at least recently will be taken into account. Obviously, I think one of the biggest things that falls under what I would call a coaching tendency umbrella is rotations, right? We have a pretty strong sense of what the rotations are of a certain team on the court, right? If rotations have changed recently, we have a way of kind of picking up the change in the way that a team is playing, at least in the recent history. that said, it gets to kind of a gray area that gets kind of tough, where if a rotation has changed just in the last game, for example, it can be kind of hard to identify if that's the start of a new trend or if that was just an outlier game. Similarly with injuries, right? If a key player is out for a team or a key set of players is out for a team and we don't have a lot of other recent games to go off of how a rotation might look for that game, can be kind of tough to determine where the minutes are going to go and what players are going to be on the court with each other at the same time. I know Max has mentioned before, well, actually, I don't even want to say mentioned. Max basically has a entire video up on our YouTube channel that dives into how he gets a little bit of an edge doing that kind of research, right? Looking at SaberSim's projections for minutes and fantasy points, comparing that to what team rotations look like on Popcorn Machine, and also just historically who played how many minutes, looking at what the game scripts were for certain games, identifying if a player that missed 8 minutes of their expected 28 minutes was out because of foul trouble, or if that's a legitimate change in the rotation. That whole strategy is summarized pretty well here in this How to Beat Daily Fantasy Basketball Like an NBA DFS Pro video that's up on our YouTube channel. So yeah, I think it's tough. I also think there's another component of that with matchups, especially as we get into the playoffs. Something that is very hard to predict with kind of a model is a specific matchup that a team may take to shut down another team in a particular way. Right. And you'll see this a lot as we get into the playoffs, where I typically wouldn't key too much into this in the regular season. But when a team is playing against another team, potentially 7 games in a row, you will see rotations change and transform in strategies. Like, I think the coaching tendencies component at that point matters a little bit more in a way that I guess manual intervention can add value. Right. Whereas in the regular season, I don't think you get that as much. But if there's if there's a big that's causing a lot of trouble for a team that maybe typically plays a little bit smaller, you may see some of those end of the bench big guys getting a little bit more minutes to kind of try to stop that guy. Right. Or if there's 6-man for one team has been going off nightly, you may see a perimeter defensive specialist getting a little bit more action to specifically match up against that guy every single time he's on the court. Those are things that if you are kind of studying the flow of playoff series, I think you can focus on and add a little value, even just by making minor adjustments, right? When I make those kinds of adjustments, I still stay within that 10% umbrella that I always talk about here. I don't want to completely change the way that we're simulating a game, but that can be a good way to add some value as well. So Stanley says that perfect. That answers my question. Yeah. So I'm glad. It is a little bit of it's a little bit of a gray area here to avoid that kind of double counting. I would say that, the one other thing here too, that I always like to mention when I answer questions like these, it's twofold, I guess, really. The first is to run your test build, right? Remember, starting with a test build and understanding who the model's high on already and who the model's not high on is a helpful way to start this, because coaching tendencies or anything else, right? If you're getting a ton of exposure to a particular player that you like for one reason or another in your research, it's good to have that test build done, because then you don't really need to make any adjustments, right? You're already getting a ton of that guy. That's probably something that's already baked in. The other thing is the ownership, the game theory side of this, right? I think it's finding reasons to play more a player that's already going to be the chalkiest player on the slate often is something that you don't really need to do, right? Like, if you can find a reason, especially as we move on and get into these playoff slates, which I think are a lot of fun, if you can find a reason why maybe the field is undervaluing a guy that's going to go 5% owned, that based on your research, you think the coach is going to give more minutes because he matches up specifically against this team well, that's great. If that guy's going to be 50% owned, who cares, right? He's probably already projected spectacularly. The field's already on that guy. And same thing the other way, right? If the guy's going to be 40% owned or something like that, and you think that maybe there's the perception that there's an elite value play on one team, and you don't think that guy is going to get as much run because of your research of maybe something the coach said, or maybe the way that you think a team's going to match up after the previous game of the series went. Right. You stand to gain so much from a game theory standpoint of being under on that guy, even just from a pure ownership play, that studying those potential coaching tendencies and matchup tendencies beyond that can only add additional value. So, yeah. That's kind of, honestly, my general answer often for these questions in general, right? Is X accounted for in the simulations? Is the answer is generally yes, but there are limitations to doing this kind of thing. There are potential limitations to doing this with a model, with simulations, no matter what. And here's the best ways to navigate that. So anyway, enough of this question here. I think we covered that one enough. Let's keep it going on. Let's keep it going forward here. So KG, I think this is a joke. Looks like a joke, but we'll read it and we'll talk briefly about this. Said, I need the absolute best strategy to take down 100K to first in FanDuel today. No pressure though. Yeah. So the optimal strategy for tonight's slate is first you'll want to pick NBA and then FanDuel, and then you'll pick today's 2-game slate. And then the 100K to first, I believe, is a 150 max. And I think it's 10 to 50K. So you'll pick the sliders for this, and then you'll click start new build. And then the number one lineup that shows up here is actually guaranteed to win this contest. So that is all you'll have to do. So this lineup here, we'll give this just a second to load. This lineup here on the right is worth $100,000. So take a screenshot, maybe, if you want. This is the one. All jokes aside, 2-game slate. My strategy is not going to be particularly distanced from what I'm doing on a typical night. I will be doing something relatively similar to what I do most nights. Obviously, we don't get as much of an edge from late swap. I think there's a big implied edge in the way that the builder's building lineups, just because it's leveraging simulations so aggressively, right? Like, we're using each lineup is going to be represented by a single game sim, which to me, like, gets you so far there that I actually probably, jokes aside, I actually probably will be doing something kind of resembling what I just demonstrated. Obviously, there are no guarantees that you end up with the nuts from your number one Saber scoring lineup. I would say, I think a couple things that could be valuable for tonight's slate, because ownership fade is going to be cranked up so high by default. The more value you can add to the ownership projections, the better. So I think it's a really good idea to spend some time studying the ownership projections. Make sure you agree. If you have no strong feelings about it, obviously roll with what we've got. We put a lot of work into the ownership model. I think it's in a really good spot. But if you have a sense of a narrative going on here, or particular steam on one player or another based on the way news is coming out throughout the day and maybe what you're reading online and things like that, make some adjustments here. Even if one thing I always say with the ownership projections, even if you are directionally correct, it will add value, right? Let's say, okay. So, I think this Brooklyn Philly game is kind of interesting, right? Obviously plenty of narratives going on here. And maybe as you are going through this, maybe you think that it's going to be more Embiid than Jokic tonight, right? I think it will add value even if you are not exactly correct, even if you just get directionally correct here, right? So maybe you think that it's going to be 45% Embiid and Jokic comes down to 35%. And if the actual ownerships are not exactly that, but you were directionally correct that Embiid came in higher than about 30% and Jokic came in lower than 45%, because of how high this ownership fade slider is, that will give you a better set of lineups than you would have otherwise had. So I do think studying the ownership projections, especially on a 2-game slate, it's totally reasonable to do that, I think, right? There's not a lot of players in the pool. Very easy to spend some time studying that. I also highly recommend, I would say, consider dropping this minimum projection filter down to a little bit of a lower value, or even better, put it at 0 and actually just kind of decide what players at the bottom of the pool you want to include in your lineups. I'm honestly considering just leaving everyone in my pool tonight. And because we're using single game simulations to build lineups, just letting, you're not going to get a ton of any of these guys in your lineups But in the event that they show up as optimal in a particular set of simulations, I want a little bit of exposure to them. They will be exceedingly low owned. And sometimes it can help make the difference to a lineup just having some guy that's 1% or less owned on a 2-game slate that got some run in a game that maybe got out of hand, or maybe there was an injury, or maybe just got hot and the coach gave them some minutes. So, yeah. So I think that's it. Those are kind of the main things on my radar. Again, I'm not playing spectacularly different tonight in terms of overall strategy, but spend a little bit more time looking at ownership projections. Make sure you're happy with those numbers, with how high the ownership fade slider is. I would say open up your pool a little bit, maybe do a little bit more hand selecting your player pool if you want to pull some of these guys off the bottom. But I do think a 15 minimum projection is a little bit too high for tonight. I would at least bring that down to maybe 9 or so points on FanDuel or DraftKings, and at least allow these guys that have clear roles in the rotation to get into your lineups. And then that's it. So, all right, cool. Question from Kick to the Head. Crypto artist said just funny when I was doing my little bit on printing the winner. I thought it was funny, but anyway, can you explain how the leverage columns give a bit of an edge on the step 3 dial in? I get a touch confused on how best to utilize this piece of information. Yeah, let's do it. So let's pull this build back up with our winner, our GPP winner here is lineup number 1. Okay, so the best way I always, and let's bring this down a little bit and just do 20 lineups here instead. So I always like to think about this leverage column. For your average build, you go in here to build your lineups. This is more descriptive than it is predictive, or it is implying an action that needs to be taken, right? And what I mean by that is that the leverage column is just saying your exposure to a player minus their projected ownership. So it describes the set of lineups you have here. It does not, in a vacuum, it does not say, take this action, right? In other words, it's not saying and I think why this can be a little bit confusing is because I know leverage is used elsewhere in the industry and on other sites and other tools in a way that is strategic or is predictive. If another site is saying positive leverage play on this guy, it means play more of that guy. That's not really what is exactly happening here, right? So JaMychal Green has a 34.5% leverage score. That's not saying lock him in or get more. That is simply saying you have 35% more exposure to JaMychal Green than we expect the field to. That's really all that means. So how would you use this? What is the best way to use this? I like to sort it by highest positive leverage and highest negative leverage, and make sure that that is in line with the way that you want to tackle the slate. The highest positive leverage plays should essentially be in order the plays in which you are most confident on in the slate. If it is not, you should make adjustments to your exposure or to your projections until it is. So for example, right, let's go through this and say, yeah, okay, I'm in on Embiid, I'm in on Curry. I'm not so sure that JaMychal Green is the third most confident player. The third player for which I'm the most confident about on the slate, right? I don't know if I need 35 percentage points of leverage on JaMychal Green, but I like the idea of being over on him. I like the idea of being over on a player that might get 5% ownership on a 2-game slate. So let's knock that down a touch, right? And now maybe this feels a little bit better. Same way, let's go the other direction here. Is your most confident fade on the entire slate Jokic? It isn't for me personally. In fact, I probably maybe want to, I'm willing to do a little bit of trusting the Sims here, but I probably want to be about maybe half the field or so. Let's get a little bit of Jokic exposure, right? Now my biggest fades are some of these value guards for the Sixers, right? I guess Maxi's not really so much a value anymore, 7,500 on FanDuel, but now that works, right? And you can kind of see. So that's essentially what the leverage column is used for, is a way of describing the way that your lineups are currently set up, who your biggest stands are and who your biggest fades are. The one other thing, I think the one other way you can kind of think about this is that it is not just it's really not so much just like the order of players. I think there's also a little bit of a magnitude thing here too. So like you could essentially say that you are twice as confident about Joel Embiid as you are Nick Claxton, right? And if that, I know those sometimes aren't super intuitive distinctions, but what I'm basically trying to say is that both the order of the players, right, as you go down sorting one direction or the other, and also the actual number here as it compares to other numbers matters in theory. So yeah, so Kick to the Head said that's fantastic. I was reading it completely wrong. That provides good feedback on the pool. Thank you. Yeah. And I know it can be a little confusing. Leverage. Leverage, I think, is one of those DFS terms that is used a lot of different ways in the industry. Mostly because it kind of has a pretty generic definition as it relates to DFS at all, right? I mean, if you think about what leverage is in real life, right? Like literally using a lever, you're getting more force out of the other side from less force applied on one side, right? That's literally what that means. So in the case of like the way we're defining it here, right? You are getting additional value. You are getting additional relative edge on the field by rostering a player at a particular exposure, I guess is the idea of the way we're thinking about it here. So the leverage, as you may see it elsewhere, right, with other tools where they're saying this is like a leverage score with certain players, that's a similar idea. But what they're saying is that it's almost saying that there's potential actual leverage that could be gained. This is like actual leverage. Basically, if this number is accurate, you literally have 51.1% of mathematical leverage over the field on Stephen Curry. When you see leverage applied elsewhere in the DFS space where people are saying, this player has this % chance to be optimal, or what I do in my research builds, right? This player has this % chance to be optimal and he's going to be owned in this many lineups, right? That's almost a theoretical leverage. If you could create every lineup that could be possibly made, that's how much leverage you would have against a hypothetical field. Anyway, I'm rambling now. Feeling kind of chatty today, so let's not create any confusion here before we move on. So, okay, and then there was another question here. This one says, is there a range of Saber scores that you will or will not use? My current scores for something look like 199, 99, 98, 89. With that sudden drop, would you try to rebuild to get all the scores in the 90s? No, probably not, to be honest. I think SaberScore, does a pretty good job of quantifying upside. I'm looking to see if we have an example like that in our pool. So typically, again, just like we talked about yesterday, I will basically just use SaberScore to be the tiebreaker to decide what lineups ultimately end up in play after I've made all the other adjustments I want to. I think that's the optimal usage for SaberScore. I do think there is something interesting about looking at where there are drops in SaberScore, but I don't think there's anything really much practical to do with that unless you were only playing a small set of lineups, right? If there was a drop, let's say we had, 100, 99, 98, 99, and then this next lineup was like 92. The builder is saying that there is probably some kind of, somewhat measurable difference between lineup 4 and lineup 5 in this case. And maybe it's to your advantage to just play 4 lineups instead of playing all 5 lineups. For your average slate, if you're multi-entering, playing a bunch of lineups, I don't think I would do anything different. I don't think I would rebuild either. If you rebuild, the problem ultimately is that you're not going to... Okay, let me back up. Saber scores are relative to the build that you're currently looking at because they are dependent on the individual simulations that were used to build that lineup in this build, right? So even if we ran another build right now, we might get this same lineup somewhere in our pool, probably still in our top 20, but it might have a different Saber score because a different simulation was used to arrive at this lineup beforehand. So you don't really want to compare lineups. You don't really want to compare Saber scores of lineups in between builds. And I don't really think it makes sense to try to build more lineups to get higher Saber scores, I would probably still just, play the highest SaberScore lineups possible once you've added value to the rest of the process elsewhere, whatever that means for you. Like I'm also perfectly fine. If you built your pool of lineups here and you made a bunch of adjustments to projections and exposures, and when you ended up with your final pool of 20, you had lineups that were lineup number 450 and your SaberScore was 86 or something like that. That's probably still fine. You're still talking about the best 500 or like a set of 500 viable lineups. Like even here's a good example, right? We're down at lineup 148. I'm still perfectly fine playing this lineup, even though there's a drop in SaberScore. So I wouldn't overly worry about what the actual individual SaberScores of your lineups are. So, okay. Let's keep it going. I see some questions in YouTube chat. We'll get there after I hit this one. This is the last question in Slack. It says, I've been experimenting with percentiles lately. What would you say is too high of a percentile realistically to look at when researching? What would be the max? I hope this makes sense. Yeah, it does. A lot of times I kind of cap at about 95th percentile. I like to think about that as the player has, I like to think about that as about a player's ceiling, right? That is roughly 2 standard deviations away from the mean, for at least for a normally distributed player. And I like to think about it as their kind of functional ceiling. Obviously, they have more upside than that. But for the purposes of researching, I like to work with the 95th percentile. Honestly, it's probably not going to kill you to go to 99th in NBA. In other sports, you will start to see some weird results at 99th percentile. A really good example of that is like NFL Showdown. If you turn it on to 99th percentile, you will see players that their mean expectation may literally be to not even get in the game. And they have like a 6 or 7.99th percentile because there are simulations where they score a weird random touchdown on a goal line play or something like that. Since NBA is not a super event-based sport and distributions are pretty normal, you're probably not even going to hurt too much by using 99th percentile. I've just gotten the habit of using 95th for pretty much everything, and that's kind of where I stick to. So, yeah. Let me know if that helps. Okay, cool. Let's hop over to YouTube chat real quick. Ron said, for 2-game slates, do you set max number of players from the same team? Ooh, good question. You know what I've been doing recently? This is kind of a recent. So I've been doing a for NBA in particular, I've been liking to do a research build to actually see what the stack types look like in the optimal. And so let's do one. I think this is kind of a cool tool to use here. So the reason this kind of works, right, is because correlations are low in NBA. So I think it's a pretty good, I think you can run a research build and look at what individual optimals for the slate look like and actually learn something useful about lineup construction, because correlation isn't a primary factor in building effective lineups, right? Even on the slates like last night where the correlation slider is a little higher, the actual values of individual player correlation are low enough that it's not a big factor. If you were to do this on baseball, for example, what I'm trying to avoid is somebody watching this and being like, oh, I'm going to do this for baseball when baseball starts up. If you run a research build for baseball and then go over to stack types, you will see a bunch of tiny, small little, you'll see a bunch of small stacks, right? Because the optimal for a given baseball lineup is just going to be all the guys that hit like 2 home runs that slate. And you don't want to build like that. Then you're giving up a correlation edge. But in this case, also, I guess the other factor here is that correlations in NBA already are mostly negative. So by avoiding stacks, period, you're generally not going to hurt yourself. So anyway, what I've been doing recently is I go in here and I do my research build and I look at what stack types show up in the optimal. On tonight's slate, I might set a rule that says something like no more than 4 from the same team, right? There are clearly a chunk of lineups where 4 players from the same team can be optimal tonight. but like here, right? Like almost 25%, 30% of lineups have a 4 stack. I might be willing to give up the weird situation where a 5 or a 6 stack ends up optimal. 3% is a decent chunk, but yeah, I might set something like that for tonight. But just so I can show you, let's bounce back to yesterday, and I'll show you what this looked like for a 12-game slate. And I think this can kind of be a pretty useful tool. In fact, at the start of the season, when we were recording these videos, Max mentioned this was basically something he did almost every slate, is set a rule for how many players per team to use. And I was never able to really come up with a way that I was able to do that in a way that felt systematic, that like on a per slate basis, I was able to figure out exactly how many players from the same team I wanted to use. And I've been doing this recently and I kind of like it. So let's look at what last night looked like. And I definitely set a rule last night. I think it was 3. I think it was max 3 players per team. Which is actually, funny enough, that's the rule that Max says that he uses pretty much every single slate. But I do think based on the research build we just ran, I think that's a little low for tonight, right? There are clearly quite a few 4 players from the same team optimals showing up in a 1500 slate sim. So let's look at what this looks like. And let me know if I lost anybody here, if I lost anybody through my thought process, because I feel like I'm kind of glossing over this kind of quickly. But the idea here is we can basically look, because there are basically no positive correlations in basketball anyway. We can just look at what the slate optimals look like and figure out where to cap our maximum player from one team, right? So if there were heavy positive correlations in basketball, you wouldn't want to do this, because you're not accounting for correlation when you run this research build. But on average, it works. So yeah, okay. So here, right? So you start to see there's some 4 stacks that have a very small chance to be optimal, but it's mostly 2 or even 3 players from the same team. Honestly, last night was such a huge slate that you probably could have gotten away with max 2 players from the same team. There's not even a lot of three on the same team lineups showing up as optimals here. But I did max 3 last night. So anyway, for tonight, I like the idea of doing probably max 4 per team. I think is a good approach, but okay. Chiketio said, how do you include players in your pool that are below 15 points projected? Yeah, so you'll have to remove the filter. So there's a default filter that's set. And this is mostly just to protect generally on most slates. I think this is a good filter. I think actually a lot of times I even raise it higher. But on a 2-game slate, I want to be a little cautious of doing this. So it's up here, this little guy. If you click this, it'll open up your filters. And you can see by default, there's an include players with my projection is greater than 15. I think the easiest thing to do here is just to set that to 0 and click apply, and that'll put everybody in your pool, and then you can decide what players end up in your actual pool for tonight by unchecking them. Maybe you take off a couple of these guys at the bottom. Dawn said, is there a video that describes unique, random, and rank in the entry editor? Yeah, there is. I am entered tonight now. Let's see. It's actually in the entry editor. So, if you click this little tooltip right here, this will pop up a short little video that explains each of the fill methods. There's also a hover in the actual fill here. If you hover this, that kind of explains them. If we have a little time at the end of the stream, I will just do it live here, but I see there's still quite a few questions to get to. So I'm going to hit those questions first, just because this is kind of captured in other videos. But if we have time at the end, I'll just do a quick review of what each of them do. So, and then Brad says, I wanted to ask again about the unique fill from yesterday, and I apologize for beating a dead horse. But if you're maxing a 20 or 150 or whatever, maybe using unique fill won't matter. Or did I understand that correctly? Yeah, so fill methods, first of all, fill methods only matter if you're playing multiple contests, or actually even better, really, if you are using a single build that fills multiple contests, right? Let's imagine just for a minute, hypothetically, and say that the only contest I was playing tonight is this one. At that point, if I have a 20 lineup build, right, it does not matter how I fill it. Rank, unique random, exact match are all going to do the identical thing. The same 20 lineups are going to end up in this contest no matter what. The reason we need to have fill methods is because now if we're playing both of these contests, now there's kind of some uncertainty, right? Or at least the builder doesn't necessarily just know what you want to do, right? Some people want the same 20 in both of those. Others want 40 lineups thrown randomly assigned into each set of 20. Others want, I'm basically walking through each individual fill method here, right? The first one was rank. The second one, a random lineup into each of them is unique random. Some people are going to want a unique lineup in each of them, but they want their highest SaberScore lineups in the and one and their 21 through 40th SaberScore lineups in the quarter jukebox. That's unique rank, right? And an exact match in this case would basically do the exact same thing that rank does, right? So really what the fill methods are for is there are for situations where you are filling multiple contests with the same set of lineups, because it tells the app how you want those filled in. So I think, Brad, on that, I know you had sent me a message in Slack yesterday, right? Like if you are just playing a single contest, right? It really doesn't matter how you fill it. It's the same 20 lineups goes into a 20 max. Great, done. It's when you are filling multiple contests with a single set of lineups that you need to kind of explain to the builder or to the app how you want them filled. That's what the fill methods are. So let me know if that helps. But Brad also got his DK picture changed too. Congrats. You're ready. You're ready for the winner's circle. See you up there tonight. Crypto Artist said, I know this is premature with MLB. Does the sim take into account the weather as it may change on any given day or hour, or do we manually make changes when we hear what the forecast is? No, it does. It does take into account the weather. So it takes into account wind too is such a big factor in baseball. So that's all taken into account. And I believe it's updated with each sim. So certain ballparks, right? Like a wind blowing out in a Wrigley Field game, it will just basically instantly make that game chalky, and also like the best projected hitting environment on the slate, depending on what else is on there, but often becomes a really good hitting environment, right? So yeah, no, that's all captured in the sims. I would say the one exception to that really is we don't attempt to simulate postponements. So, oh God, man, just talking about this is getting me excited for baseball. I hope they get a deal done soon, but we don't simulate postponement risk. That's something we've kind of talked about, a way to model, but it's kind of tricky. So essentially, if there's a game where there's a rain risk, we will assume that game plays 100% of the time. So you need to decide what your own personal risk tolerance is to that game, right? Let's say there's two terrible pitchers going against each other in Coors Field, and all the Coors hitters project for really great scores, right? They're all super chalky, but that game has, something like a 50% chance to get postponed, right? Well, that's when the fun starts, right? Or not so much, I guess, but you need to decide what your own personal risk tolerance is to that game environment. The rain and the weather and the temperature and the wind direction is captured in the simulation, but we never assume a game is going to get postponed. So, but Brad said, I'm not a super tech guy, but I feel like that's super impressive that the sim picks up the weather and adjusts accordingly. It's pretty sick. It is pretty cool. I will say that. Weather is such a big factor in baseball. It's a huge factor into the way that you would project hitters and pitchers and things like that, it kind of has to be completely honest. Especially in certain ballparks, it's just like Wrigley is the classic example. You can't really project hitting performance in Wrigley Field without knowing how the wind's blowing, because it will change completely. Like even a 10 mile an hour sustained winds out to center is like everything's going to carry like mad. So yeah, but it is pretty cool. So yeah. All right, let's bounce back to Slack. There was a question from James in here. This is the last question in the queue. So if you guys have more questions, fire away. at about the 45-minute mark here. So we'll keep on trucking here. James said, how aggressive should I be on a 2-game slate with sim variance for NBA? Also, would you consider locking in the best stud players for a 20 max lineup, or do you just recommend generating the 20 lineups on whatever stud players the Sims gives to run those lineups? So on tonight's slate, I would be very aggressive with my sim variance. In fact, I'm probably just going to put it to 10 to everything I'm playing. Even if the defaults are 9, 2-game slate, larger field stuff, just give me single game simulations, right? Yeah, I mean, by default, it's probably going to be, so like, I think, for like the and 1, the quarter jukebox, the 4-point play, by default, it's going to be at 9. I'm probably just going to put it to 10 just because I like using single game sims when I can get away with it. But I would say almost under no circumstances would I turn sim variance down from the default tonight, because it's 2-game slate. You need to be very aggressive with your variance settings. This second question here, would I consider locking in the best stud players for a 20 max lineup, or do I just recommend generating the 20 lineups on whatever stud players the sim gives you and just run those lineups? A couple notes on this. So first of all, I generally don't like the idea of locking players in step 1, at least not without first running a test build, right? The reason why is because I think it's useful to see, how the model is looking at the slate, right? You might be locking in a player that you're getting 0% exposure to on your test build, which is okay, but you should at least be conscious of that and have an opportunity to check your work, check your research, check your priors or your biases, right? I was pretty surprised to see that on the FanDuel build we did at the start of the stream that we were getting 100% Embiid and 0% Jokic, right? If I had just come in here and just said lock button Jokic all in, right? That might be fine. Jokic might be optimal. That might be the better play, but I would have had no opportunity to kind of at least check and see why was I getting so much Embiid over Jokic, just for example, right? In general, though, I think if you want to lock a player in, right, if that's kind of your play style, that's fine. But I would say once you've allow yourself to have done your research first, which is, I mean, even your research being just limited to a test build and only to a test build. On tonight's slate, like a 2-game slate, I don't think you can really go wrong even on any player in the pool by locking them in, because there's so few players in the pool. Virtually any of these guys have a pretty decent shot to show up in the optimal lineup, with obviously some exceptions down here at the bottom. But on a slate like last night, locking a player in is a way more aggressive move, right? Because there's 12 games, there's so many players on the slate. You're taking a much more aggressive stand by just locking a player into all 20, for example. Doesn't mean it's necessarily wrong, but it's more aggressive the more players on the slate there are. So yes, I think this does come down a little bit to personal risk tolerance. There are players out there, there are DFS players that are going to lock in 2 to 4 guys every single night, because that's kind of that's their strategy, right? They like the idea of locking in a core and then rotating all the other possible combinations around that and trying to, basically just give yourself as many chances to win when your core is right. For others, even having 50% exposure to a single player might be far too much, right? I play somewhere in between those two. I'm not like a super core focused kind of player. So I guess wrapping this question up, how I actually handle this, I almost never intentionally go in and press the lock button on a player. That's just not how I play. I will happily have 100% exposure to a player if that's what makes sense, but rarely am I going in and just saying lock on that guy. So let me know if that kind of helps. I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that, and let's move on here. So Brad said, now that we're a few weeks away from the All-Star break, I hope the sim has had enough info to pick up on the 76ers and Brooklyn's rotations and minutes up to this point. Yeah, I mean, I think so. But there's always, yeah, I think we're definitely probably getting a pretty typical Sixers rotation tonight. The Nets are a little weirder, but yeah, I feel like it's pretty pretty typical. I mean, Durant and Kyrie just don't play a ton of games together, right? Yeah. Yeah. I think so. I mean, and Aldridge is out tonight. Yeah, I don't think we're at the point at this point where I would say that there's like natural uncertainty to the Sims for either of those teams, or at least not as much. That's all, of course, hinging on the idea that nobody gets surprise ruled out. But I think it's yeah, no, I would say so. And I think we're probably going to get it's going to be an interesting slate here tonight because, both of these teams are in the playoff hunt, or all four of these teams are in the playoff hunt. They're all good teams. Brooklyn and Philly, I think, have a little bit of an extra narrative incentive here. I think all four of these teams are going to play really hard tonight. I think you're going to get a little bit of a sneak peek of like playoff feeling basketball tonight, which is kind of fun. So just looking at this, I think there's an argument to be made that like we're pretty low on both of these guys. That maybe we are assuming that there is like more usage spread out to some of these other guys than there is in actuality. But it's also possible that they're just overpriced. But yeah, I don't know. So I guess in summary here, I wouldn't. At this point, I don't think there's a lack of information problem for simulations with these teams. But Young God says with cash, you don't mess with settings at all, right? Yeah, I wouldn't. First of all, I wouldn't play cash tonight. I think you're asking for trouble playing cash on 2-game NBA slates. But yes, my cash game process, if I were playing, would essentially be to set the cash game sliders and play the number one optimal lineup in everything. Is basically what I would do, and then late swap every time a game started, basically. So cool. I think we'll go ahead and leave it there. I don't see any other questions coming in. We've gotten through everything here for today. Right at about the 53-minute mark or so. So a good stream here today. Talked about a handful of different things. Definitely a lot of NBA 2-game slate strategy, which is exciting. Should be a fun slate here tonight. Obviously, the new MMA Sims, the new update to the MMA side of the app. If you missed the start of the stream, definitely go check that out. We've got a card here on Saturday that I'm looking forward to testing it out. And we will be having some more MMA streams and some more MMA content here coming out in the near future. So in the meantime, good luck on the slates tonight. 2-game NBA slate, 13-game slate of hockey if you're playing that. And I will see you all right back again tomorrow. Same time, same place, 2 p.m. Eastern. So see you guys.